The news landed like a thunderclap. Prince William has reportedly made a move that feels less like family drama and more like a quiet declaration of how things are going to work from now on. And the detail that makes the whole thing fascinating isn't even the headline itself. It's that Princess Anne apparently saw it happen and said absolutely nothing, which, if you know anything about how that woman operates, is basically the royal equivalent of standing up and slow clapping. The story is that William effectively expelled Camilla's grandson from Windsor, or at least made it very clear that the free access and casual proximity to the inner royal circle that Camilla's family had been enjoying was over. And the way it was handled tells you everything about where the power actually sits right now. So here's where this gets interesting. For years, Camilla's family has been around, not officially, not with titles, not with any constitutional role, but physically present at the kind of events that signal belonging. Christmas at Sandringham family gatherings, the kind of appearances that make photographers take note and make royal watchers start asking questions about whether the line between royal and non-royal is getting blurry. Camilla has 5 grandchildren through her 2 children from her first marriage. Tom Parker Bowles is 50 years old, works as a food writer and critic, and has 2 kids, Lola and Freddie. Laura Lopes is in the art world and has 3 children, Eliza, Gus, and Louie. These 5 kids are Camilla's biological grandchildren. They hold no titles, no HRH prefix, no official role, and no place in the line of succession. They are in the legal and constitutional sense regular citizens who happen to have a grandmother who married the king. And for a while, that seemed like enough. They attended royal events. They were included in Christmas celebrations. In 2024, Camilla's children and grandchildren were at Sandringham for the first time, which royal commentators treated as a significant moment of blending, of acceptance, of the family finally becoming one big integrated unit after all those years of scandal and public hostility. The narrative was that Camilla had completed this remarkable transformation from the most hated woman in England to a respected queen, and her family was being brought into the fold as part of that redemption arc. But then 2025 happened and the invitation didn't come. Tom Parker Bowles confirmed that neither he nor his sister Laura would be attending Christmas at Sandringham that year. And the official explanation was that the gathering was going to be smaller, more private, more focused on the immediate family because of the king's ongoing cancer treatment. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. The king is 77 years old. He's dealing with a serious health situation. It makes sense to keep things intimate. But here's the thing that makes that explanation fall apart when you actually look at who was there. Beatrice and Eugenie attended. Prince Andrew's daughters, whose father had been stripped of his royal titles and effectively exiled from public life, were at Sandringham. They chose loyalty to the monarchy over their disgraced father, and they were welcomed. So the Christmas table wasn't strictly limited to working royals or even to people without controversy attached to their names. It was limited in a way that specifically excluded Camilla's biological family while including other non-working members of the extended Windsor clan. That's not a scheduling conflict. That's a boundary being drawn. And this is where William comes in, because the timing of all this lines up with something bigger that's been happening behind the scenes. William has been very clear both in his actions and in what palace insiders report about his thinking that he envisions a slimmed-down monarchy. He wants a focused, efficient royal operation centered on the direct line of succession, and a small group of working royals who actually carry out engagements and justify their public funding. He's watched what happens when the royal family gets too big, too sprawling, too full of peripheral figures who attract media attention without contributing anything meaningful. The Prince Andrew situation was the obvious cautionary tale, and William was reportedly the one pushing hardest for a swift resolution there. Sources described him as smoldering on the sidelines while Charles hesitated, frustrated that the institution wasn't moving fast enough to cut out a clearly damaging element. When Charles finally removed Andrew's titles in late 2025, it was widely understood that William and Camilla had been aligned on that decision, both pushing for action. But sharing an enemy doesn't create a permanent alliance, and the deeper issue between William and Camilla has always been there, rooted in something that no amount of polite public appearances can erase. Camilla was central to the breakdown of William's parents' marriage. Diana described her marriage as crowded, and everyone knew what she meant. William grew up watching his mother suffer, watching the public humiliation play out in tabloids and television interviews, watching his father choose another woman while his family fell apart. For years after Charles and Camilla married, William kept a careful distance, polite, dutiful, never openly hostile, but not warm either. People who knew them described a chill that never quite thawed, a friendliness in public and a caution in private. They found common ground during the Andrew crisis because both of them care about protecting the institution. But that's not the same as trust, and it's certainly not the same as wanting someone's grandchildren permanently embedded in the royal orbit. Now in November 2025, William and Kate moved their family from Adelaide Cottage to Forest Lodge on the Windsor Home Park estate, and palace insiders read this as a significant strategic move. They were creating their own court, their own household, physically separate from Buckingham Palace and operationally distinct from the current king's setup. The message was clear. The Wales family is building its own future with its own priorities, and its own definition of who belongs in the inner circle. George, Charlotte, and Louis are the core. Kate's family, the Middletons, are managed and accepted in a limited way, but Camilla's grandchildren represent a kind of complexity that doesn't fit the streamlined model. They're not Windsors, they're not working royal, they're not in the line of succession. Their connection to the crown is entirely through Camilla, and when Charles eventually passes, Camilla's status changes dramatically. She becomes Queen Dowager, her household budget gets renegotiated. Her access to royal life shifts, and everything comes under the authority of the new king. The new king being William, the man whose mother she helped push aside in the public eye. That's the structural reality that makes this reported expulsion from Windsor so significant. William isn't just being petty about his father's wife's grandchildren. He's setting the template for what his monarchy will look like. And he's doing it while Charles is still on the throne, which is the part that signals how much informal power has already shifted. Charles remains king. He still holds constitutional authority, but the power to shape public perception, to plan for the future, to decide who gets access to what spaces and what events, that's increasingly flowing toward William, and the palace machinery is actively elevating him. They're preparing for the transition, and part of that preparation involves deciding who will be part of the next reign and who will not. And then there's Princess Anne, who is somehow the most telling part of this whole situation, precisely because she hasn't said a word. Anne completed 478 official engagements in 2025, more than anyone else in the royal family, including William. At 74 years old, she works harder than people half her age, and she operates according to a personal code that values duty, discretion, and dignity above everything. She's known Camilla for decades, moving in the same horse-riding circles long before Charles and Camilla's relationship became public. She attended their wedding in 2005. She's maintained a respectful relationship with her sister-in-law. But Anne is also fiercely loyal to the institution, and she witnessed everything. She saw the damage Charles's affair did to the monarchy. She saw Diana's public suffering. She saw the strain it put on William and Harry. She's never commented publicly on any of it, choosing instead to just keep working, keep showing up, keep doing the job while others created chaos around her. So when reports emerged that William had made a move to limit Camilla's family's access to Windsor and Anne was present and said nothing, that silence is loud. Royal commentators, though careful to note that nothing is officially confirmed, have suggested that Anne supports William's approach to modernizing the monarchy. She reportedly sees similar values in him: responsibility over comfort, the institution over personal interests, duty over family sentiment. If William is quietly pushing Camilla's relatives to the margins, Anne is almost certainly aware of it, and her lack of objection is its own form of endorsement. In the royal family, where direct statements are rare and symbolism carries enormous weight, silence from someone like Anne is more meaningful than a press release. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, what's happening here isn't really about one grandson being told he's not welcome at Windsor. It's about the end of an era and the beginning of another. Camilla's journey from mistress to queen is genuinely one of the most remarkable personal rehabilitations in modern British history. The British press once labeled her the most hated woman in England. And yet she stood beside Charles at his coronation in May 2023, crowned as queen, a title that seemed impossible for her just a decade earlier. But rehabilitation has limits, and permanently embedding a non-royal family within the royal circle was always going to be a harder sell once the king who made it possible was no longer the one holding all the cards. The benefits Camilla's grandchildren enjoyed, the invitations, the proximity, the subtle inclusion in royal life were tied to Charles's reign. When that reign ends, the new king will set new boundaries, and William has made it clear that his boundaries will be tighter. This isn't necessarily personal, or at least not entirely personal. William's vision for the monarchy is structural. He wants the Windsors to perform clear public roles with maximum legitimacy and minimum complexity. Anyone around them who doesn't contribute is, in his view, a potential risk. Camilla's family, however much the king may personally care for them, represents exactly the kind of complexity that doesn't fit. They're not royals. They were never going to be royals. They were connected to royalty only through their grandmother's extraordinary rise, and that connection was always contingent on Charles being the one in charge. What makes the timing of all this so pointed is that Charles is 77, undergoing cancer treatment. And while his doctors say his health is improving and he's planning a major state visit to Washington in spring 2026, the reality is that the transition is already underway at everything but title. He still holds power. But the kind of power that shapes the future, the planning, the personnel decisions, the quiet signaling about who belongs and who doesn't, that's increasingly William's domain. The palace is boosting his public profile. They're preparing him for what's coming. And part of that preparation means making decisions now about what the next reign will look like so that when the moment arrives, the framework is already in place. Camilla herself is at a turning point. She struggled with fatigue from pneumonia in late 2024, has ongoing mobility issues, and at 78 is naturally reducing her workload. Reports suggest her role will shift significantly, stepping back from duties that younger royals can take over while remaining an influential figure behind the scenes. But as she steps back, her leverage to protect her family's position diminishes. The arrangements about who does what, who gets access to which spaces, who appears on palace balconies, and who sits at Christmas tables are being quietly renegotiated. And in that negotiation, Camilla's non-royal family is losing ground. The thing about royal watching is that the real story is almost never in the official announcements. It's in the patterns. It's in who shows up and who doesn't. It's in the seating arrangements and the Christmas invitations and the subtle shifts in who gets photographed standing near whom. It's in the silence of the people who would speak up if they disagree. Princess Anne, working her way through nearly 500 engagements a year, saying nothing while the future king draws new lines around the family, is the kind of detail that tells you everything. She's seen scandals come and go since the 1970s. She's watched marriages collapse, reputations burn, and the monarchy nearly lose its footing more than once. If she's not objecting to what William is doing, it's because she understands exactly why it needs to happen. William's monarchy, when it comes, will not be a continuation of Charles's. It will be smaller, tighter, more focused on the direct line and a handful of trusted working royals. Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, have become reliable supporters and will likely have roles. Anne will be included as long as she's able. George will eventually join as he matures, and discussions about his schooling are already underway as he approaches 13. But Camilla's grandchildren, the Parker Bowles and Lopes kids, who were never royal to begin with, are not part of that plan. They were never going to be. Their presence in royal spaces was always a reflection of Charles's personal wishes, not institutional logic. And when Charles's reign ends, the institutional logic takes over. So when you hear that William expelled Camilla's grandson from Windsor and Anne silently approved, the real story isn't about one awkward confrontation or one family dispute. It's about the quiet, methodical construction of a new royal order happening right now while Charles still wears the crown. The faces on the palace balconies, the names on the Christmas lists, the children growing up close to Windsor, all of it is being reevaluated through the lens of what William thinks the monarchy should be. And what William thinks, based on everything he's done and everything the palace has signaled, is that the monarchy should be lean, legitimate, and uncluttered by people who don't have a clear reason to be there. Camilla's family, through no fault of their own, falls on the wrong side of that line. They were beneficiaries of a unique historical moment, a window of acceptance that opened when Charles finally married the woman he'd loved for decades and closed when the future king decided that his reign would be built differently. Princess Anne, watching all of this with decades of experience and a commitment to duty that has never wavered, apparently sees the logic. And in the royal family, where words are rare and silence is strategic, that quiet approval might be the most significant statement anyone has made. But to really understand the weight of what's happening, you have to understand the peculiar position Camilla's grandchildren occupy in the first place. They exist in a kind of constitutional gray zone that the British system has never quite had to deal with before. When a monarch marries someone who already has children from a previous marriage, those children don't automatically become royal. That much is clear. But what happens when those children have children of their own, and the monarch treats them as beloved grandchildren, inviting them to family events, giving them access to royal residences, allowing them to form relationships with the actual royal grandchildren? That's uncharted territory, and it's territory that Charles seemed happy to explore without ever formally defining it. He wanted the warmth of a blended family without confronting the constitutional awkwardness of what that actually meant. William, by contrast, appears to have no interest in ambiguity. He wants clarity, and clarity means drawing lines that Charles was content to leave blurry. This difference in approach between father and son is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in the current royal landscape. Charles spent decades waiting to be king, and when he finally ascended, he wanted his reign to reflect his personal values, warmth, inclusion, a certain emotional openness that previous generations had suppressed. Bringing Camilla's family into the fold was part of that project. It signaled that the monarchy could be modern, could embrace complexity, could make space for people who didn't fit the traditional template. But William watched that same approach create confusion. He saw the media start treating Camilla's grandchildren as quasi-royals, photographing them at events, speculating about their roles, blurring the distinction between who was officially part of the institution and who was merely connected to it. For someone who prizes institutional clarity above almost everything else, that blurring wasn't a sign of progress. It was a problem waiting to happen. And here's where the geography of the whole situation becomes impossible to ignore. Windsor is not just any royal residence. It's the symbolic heart of the monarchy in many ways. The place where the family retreats, where the most private moments happen, where the line between public duty and personal life is carefully managed. Allowing Camilla's grandchildren to have what was described as free access to Windsor was a significant concession, one that suggested they were being treated as de facto members of the inner family circle regardless of their official status. When William reportedly moved to revoke or severely limit access, he wasn't just adjusting a logistical arrangement. He was redefining who gets to be inside the circle and who has to remain outside it. The physical boundary of Windsor's walls became a metaphor for the institutional boundary he intends to enforce. The reaction from palace staff, at least according to what's been reported through various channels, has been telling in its own right. Staff who have served through multiple reigns understand better than anyone that the monarchy is an organism that adapts to survive. They've watched favorites rise and fall, seen family members come in and out of favor, learned to read the subtle signals that indicate where power is flowing. When the staff at Windsor began operating under new guidance about who could access certain areas and who required additional clearance, they understood immediately that this wasn't a minor administrative change. It was a reflection of a fundamental shift in the balance of influence within the family. The people who run the practical operations of the monarchy are often the first to know when the wind has changed direction. And in this case, the wind was blowing unmistakably from William's direction. None of this is to suggest that Camilla's grandchildren have done anything wrong or behaved in any way that would warrant exclusion. By all accounts, they're perfectly ordinary young people who happen to find themselves in an extraordinary situation through no choice of their own. Tom Parker Bowles has always been careful to maintain a respectful distance in his public comments, never presuming upon his mother's position, never acting as though he or his children were entitled to anything. Laura Lopes has been similarly discreet. The children themselves have largely stayed out of the public eye, appearing only at the kind of family events where their grandmother's presence made their attendance natural. They haven't courted publicity or sought to leverage their connection for personal advantage. If anything, they've been models of how to handle an awkward position with grace. But that's precisely what makes William's move so striking. It isn't a response to any particular incident or any failure of behavior on the part of Camilla's family. It's a structural decision made on principle, not a personal reaction to a provocation. In some ways, that makes it harder for Camilla to push back against. If her grandchildren had been excluded because of something specific they had done, she could argue about the fairness of the punishment or the proportionality of the response. But when the exclusion is based on a fundamental disagreement about who belongs in the royal orbit in the first place, there's no specific grievance to litigate. It's a clash of visions, not a family quarrel. And clashes of vision are much harder to resolve through compromise. The generational dimension of all this adds another layer of complexity that's worth examining. Charles belongs to a generation that still remembers the monarchy as something that could afford to be expansive, that could accommodate a large cast of characters, that didn't have to justify every relationship in terms of public value. He grew up in an era when the royal family was simply assumed to be a broad and somewhat sprawling institution, and his instinct has always been to replicate that model in his own way. William belongs to a generation that has watched public tolerance for royal excess evaporate in real time. He's seen the backlash against perceived freeloading, the constant scrutiny of who does what and who pays for it, the media's relentless focus on the cost of the monarchy. His instinct is to preempt those criticisms by building an institution so lean and so obviously functional that nobody can reasonably question its value. These two instincts are not compatible, and the tension between them is playing out now in decisions about things like who gets invited to Christmas and who has access to Windsor. Princess Anne, positioned between these two generations, has a perspective that neither Charles nor William can claim. She's old enough to remember the old model, practical enough to see its flaws, and close enough to William to understand where he's trying to take the institution. Her silence in this whole affair is not the silence of someone who doesn't have an opinion. It's the silence of someone whose opinion is so clear that stating it out loud would be redundant. Anne has spent her entire adult life demonstrating through action rather than words what she thinks the monarchy should be. She works relentlessly, avoids drama, stays out of scandals, and treats her position as a responsibility rather than a privilege. Everything about how she operates aligns with William's vision of a slimmed-down, hardworking monarchy. And almost nothing about how she operates aligns with the idea of extending royal privileges to people who have no official role. If she saw William drawing a line around Camilla's family and chose not to intervene, it's because she agrees with the principle behind the line, even if the specific moment of its drawing was uncomfortable. Looking ahead, the question that hangs over all of this is how Camilla will navigate the remaining years of Charles's reign, knowing that the future king is already quietly but unmistakably rolling back the accommodations she worked so hard to secure for her family. She's a pragmatist, she always has been. She survived the decades of public hostility by being patient, by not pushing too hard, by waiting for the right moments and making the right moves. But patience has its limits. And watching the ground shift under your feet while your husband still technically holds the power to prevent it must be a uniquely difficult experience. She can't publicly object without creating the kind of family drama that the palace abhors. She can't privately override William without setting up a conflict that would damage the very institution she's now part of. Her options are limited and her leverage is declining, and the person who holds most of the cards for the future appears to have already decided how he intends to play them. The broader public, for its part, seems largely unmoved by the Parker Bowles children's exclusion, which is itself a data point that probably confirms William's instincts. There was no public outcry when Tom Parker Bowles announced his family wouldn't be at Sandringham. No petitions, no newspaper campaigns, no groundswell of sympathy demanding that Camilla's grandchildren be restored to their place at the Christmas table. The British public, whatever its other feelings about the monarchy, appears to have a fairly clear sense of who counts as a royal and who doesn't. And Camilla's grandchildren, fair or not, don't make the cut in the popular imagination. William, who pays close attention to public sentiment and has shown a keen instinct for reading the room, almost certainly noticed this. If the public isn't demanding their inclusion, there's no political cost to their exclusion. And if there's no political cost, the decision becomes purely a matter of institutional preference. That institutional preference is now being codified in ways that will outlast any individual reign. The precedents being set now, the boundaries being drawn, the expectations being established about what the monarchy will look like under William, are all part of a long game that he's been playing for years. He thinks in decades, not in news cycles. He's watched the institution nearly destroy itself through carelessness and excess, and he's determined not to repeat those mistakes. If that means making uncomfortable decisions while his father is still on the throne, decisions that create awkward family dynamics and force conversations nobody wants to have, he seems willing to do it. The alternative, letting the ambiguity continue until a crisis forces a more painful reckoning, is exactly the kind of reactive governance he's trying to move away from. So the image that emerges from all of this is of a monarchy in transition, not just between reigns, but between entire philosophies of what the institution should be. Charles's monarchy is expansive, inclusive, willing to bend rules to accommodate personal relationships and complex family histories. William's monarchy will be the opposite, defined, bounded, and rigorously focused on a core mission that leaves little room for sentimental attachments to people who don't serve that mission. Camilla's grandchildren are simply the first visible casualties of that shift, the first people to discover that the access they enjoyed was never a permanent entitlement, but a temporary arrangement dependent on a particular king's particular preferences. Princess Anne, watching it all unfold with the perspective of someone who's seen every cycle the monarchy has gone through for half a century, recognizes the necessity of what's happening, even if she'd never say so publicly. And William, methodically and without fanfare, continues building the institution he intends to lead. One boundary at a time, one invitation list at a time, one quiet decision about who belongs and who doesn't at a time. The silence from the rest of the family suggests they understand exactly what's happening. The question now isn't whether the transition is underway, but how much more of it will play out before the crown itself changes hands.